What does Putin's regime want in Ukraine? Number one, regime change. Get rid of the NATO-aligned Zelensky government and get in, a Russian-aligned puppet, essentially, like Yanukovych, who was previously the leader of Ukraine about eight or 9 years ago, prior to the Euromaidan revolution or coup, however you want to call it. There were legitimate, uprising, mass protests against the appalling corruption, etc., of, Ukrainian establishment, of which Yanukovych was of course a part of. But that was then hijacked by basically the West, and it was hijacked, and we supported the current. Well, it wasn't Zelensky, but it was his predecessor, and he's basically got to power in a coup, and of course that is completely at odds with what Russia would ever possibly want, with Ukraine being seen as a red line, and being also seen as territory essentially of Russia to many Russian people and to many in the establishment of Russia. So he wants regime change. That's what I believe is the number one goal. And the second goal, which is the same thing as number one really, is they want to get rid of any NATO presence in Ukraine. Now, even though there's no official presence in terms of there's no official military bases, they are doing training camps, they are giving billions of arms, and they have been doing, the UK, America and other NATO countries, they've been given, arms shipments, weapons, missiles and all that to the Ukrainian government to fight, and that will be used against, it will be used against Russia now, and also it will be used in the Donbass against the separatists that want to separate from Ukraine. So he wants to get NATO's militarization of Ukraine out of it, basically. And that is, of course, the same as saying they want to demilitarize Ukraine. They want to take out any potential threat on its borders from NATO, basically. Because even though NATO is not officially in Ukraine, or Ukraine is not officially in NATO, that in reality, for all intents and purposes, it is. If they're supplying military bases, supplying military arms, if they're providing intelligence, if they're training troops and doing all these other stuff, and I believe that they are opening some bases there that are not officially military bases, but for all intents and purposes they probably are. So they want to get rid of those things, basically, so that there is no immediate NATO threat on Russia's border, on Russia's Ukrainian, historic Ukrainian territory. They want, of course, they do want to prevent the killings of Russians in the Donbass, in the Donetsk and the Lugansk. They want to stop the shelling, and they want, because the ceasefire hasn't basically happened since 2014, or 2015, when Minsk II was signed. The Minsk agreements have been breached. They don't. Fundamentally, as well, also they want to denazify and get rid of the fascists that are strongly within the Ukrainian military and establishment. This Azov battalion are essentially neo-Nazis, or some of them are, and they don't want that those crackpots on their border, basically on their direct, which they see as a threat to the Russians within Ukraine and for other longer term strategic reasons. Now, and of course, Russia as well, of course, wants to annex part of Ukraine. I'm not saying it wants to annex all of it. I mean, perhaps it does, but the establishment within Russia, and I don't just refer to Putin. I've seen. There's a whole section of their establishment that thinks that Ukraine should be a part of Russia, essentially, and so it's not just Putin. There's other people in the establishment. It's a common trend that they believe that parts of Ukraine especially should be a part of Russia, like the Donbass, like Crimea that was annexed, and like the Donbass. So Lugansk and Donetsk will inevitably be annexed into the Russian Empire, and probably other areas too. Now, I've heard some other people give. I believe that this was planned. I believe that as they've become more aware of NATO's involvement in Ukraine and America and UK, etc., I think that they essentially, Putin's regime have planned this war, and that they wanted strongly to go in. I think they planned it over many months, and so I don't accept the view, as some people have espoused, like Pepe Escobar, that Russian intelligence had intel that there was going to be a direct invasion of a significant number of military troops and so forth into the Donbass region by the Ukrainian military, and that this is basically a preemptive attack to stop this attack from happening. I think that is total BS. I think that's a false flag. I don't believe that they had that intelligence. I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't believe they had that intelligence. I mean, even if they had that intelligence, I don't believe that a full-scale, all-out attack on Kiev, a full-scale bombing of the country, and bombing of, they've clearly bombed civilian apartment blocks. They've bombed things that is basically a war crime, and it would be a little bit different if they had attacked the Donbass and attacked Ukrainian troops and military things in the Donbass. That would be a little bit different. I mean, it would still be a war crime. It would still be illegal to do that completely. It would be against the United Nations Charter, but it would be a little bit different. Not that US or Russia give a shit about the Charter, by the way, because they both breach it regularly. And we all know when America very recently, America's been breaching it all the time, and in Iraq and so forth, and fundamentally, but because they've done such an all-out invasion of the country, I think that it's a bit ridiculous to say that this is simply about the Donbass region. It's not. It's about full-scale regime change. That's what it is. That's why he amassed all them troops on the border, them hundreds of thousands of troops, which is still only a smallest percentage of the total military might of Russia, which is a massive country and has a moderately high population, of about 150 odd million, I think it is. I mean, I don't accept that, because there's been an armed conflict there for 8 years. I can't. So that's why I think that this has much more been planned and they've just basically thrown an excuse there that they've either bullshitted about intelligence or something and said, oh yeah, we had intel that Ukraine was going to do a bigger invasion of the Donbass, you know, killing more Russians and so forth. So we had to do it, we had to preemptively strike. I think that's BS. They've been shelling the region for years. That's looking for an excuse or making one up to do what they actually wanted to do, which was because of the increased security threat of having NATO essentially in Ukraine and America on its doorstep, because they felt as though that was unacceptable, and everything else what I've just mentioned, they thought, let's go in and let's get rid of this regime, and that's what's more than likely going to happen.